So a couple years ago, my instructor, Mr. Roy Dean, informed me that it was time to start getting myself ready for my black belt exam. I had about 6 months to get ready, and I decided that I was going to take this training as seriously as I'd ever trained before. So I put myself on a training program that I developed based on my experience having done jiu-jitsu for a long time, having been part of physical culture for a long time, but also based on the information I gleaned by doing a really deep dive into the energy systems that the body utilizes when it trains jiu-jitsu. I asked myself a really simple question: what is the body being asked to do when we train jiu-jitsu, both cardiovascularly in terms of our aerobic fitness and our anaerobic fitness, and in terms of our neuromuscular system? Based on that, I put myself on a training program that I followed religiously for 6 months. I tracked everything. I tracked all my workouts. I wore a chest strap during rolling sessions in jiu-jitsu. I tracked my sleep. I did my heart rate variability testing every morning. And I amassed a huge amount of data in order to gauge my progress. Well, the results were actually pretty spectacular relative to myself. I was able to bring myself to the best level of fitness I had ever been in my life. I had built the work capacity to be able to sustain an incredible amount of output, very, very high output for a very long, extended period of time. So today, I want to talk to you about how I got myself into the best shape I've ever been in. A couple caveats before we begin. First of all, I can't program your fitness. Nobody on YouTube can program your fitness. I know nothing about you. I don't know your starting point. I don't know your age. I don't know your mobility level, your fitness level. I know nothing about you. So I'm not suggesting that what I'm going to provide you with is how you should train. My only hope is that I can give you enough information to make better decisions about your own training. If you're training for a competition, if you have events that you're training for, hopefully this information can help you as you program yourself or as a consumer of fitness media in order to make better decisions about your own training. So that's all. The second caveat is this kind of training is not really for the absolute beginner in jiu-jitsu. This is for the intermediate athlete on up. Why? Because when you're new at jiu-jitsu, what you need is adaptation. You don't need optimization. When you're new at jiu-jitsu, you need to adapt your body to the demands of grappling. You need to be able to do it 3-4 nights a week. You need to be able to recover adequately from it. You're not ready yet to optimize your fitness, especially because there is an efficiency component to this. You can't be in good enough shape if you're inefficient. And by definition, white belts in jiu-jitsu are horribly inefficient. You're using muscular energy in very unproductive ways, and you're not going to out-fitness yourself to being able to overcome that. So what I recommend if you're new, just go to class, go to jiu-jitsu, get yourself adapted. Once you're an advanced beginner on up, then maybe you're ready to start optimizing your fitness. And I'm not saying don't watch this, you might glean some things out of it, but know that it's not really gonna help you at this stage of your journey yet. Let's begin by talking about the cardiovascular system. This is the primary engine that our body utilizes when we train jiu-jitsu, and it's really the one that's gonna give you the most bang for your buck. If you can get your cardiovascular system operating extremely efficiently, it's going to give you the most benefit of all. So, in terms of our cardio, there are two values that really matter, two data points that matter to us. The first is our aerobic threshold. The second is our anaerobic threshold, and I'm going to talk about each of those. The aerobic threshold is when your heart rate is up around 65 or 70% of your maximum. If you can stay below that value, if you can stay below 70% of your max heart rate, you are using primarily oxygen as the fuel source for your activity. It's the most efficient energy source we have. It's the most abundant, and your body is actually very, very efficient at processing oxygen. So the aerobic system is extremely important, but it's generally relatively low in terms of your heart rate. If you're 30 years old, your aerobic threshold might be 130 beats per minute. If you've done jiu-jitsu before, you know that 130 beats per minute is incredibly low. Generally, we are much higher than that when we train jiu-jitsu. And so you say, well, why should I focus on my aerobic system? One of the reasons is because if you look at elite level athletes, pro mountain bikers, pro endurance athletes, what you find is an extremely high aerobic threshold. They are able to sustain immense output within their aerobic capability, which means that they are using their body the most efficiently possible. So if as jiu-jitsu practitioners, we could dramatically increase our aerobic threshold, it means that we would be able to sustain much higher output without ever going into the alternate energy systems that we use as our heart rate gets higher and higher and higher. That's why it's important to train it. And also, the aerobic system is eminently trainable. It's one of the systems that can be trained on an ongoing long-term basis, and you can see a lot of gains in that. Again, the elite athletes have extremely high aerobic thresholds, and that's really the goal, and I'm going to talk about how we achieve that. The second value that matters is our anaerobic threshold. The anaerobic threshold kicks in probably around 85% of your maximum heart rate. Thereabouts. It's going to be a little different for each person. It's based on genetic factors and your fitness level, etc. But a good rule of thumb is about 85% of your maximum heart rate. Before I continue, how do you calculate your maximum heart rate? Well, the simplest way is to take the number 220 and subtract your age. I'm in my 50s, so 220 minus 50 is 170. My maximum heart rate is right around there, 172, 173. That's kind of the range it's in. So that's a good rule of thumb. It's not perfectly accurate. Again, your genetics play an important part of that. Some people have much higher maximum heart rates, but as a rule of thumb, that's going to get you in the ballpark, 220 minus your age. So the anaerobic threshold is the point at which our bodies are utilizing glycogen as the primary fuel source instead of oxygen. You're still using oxygen, of course, but once you go past your anaerobic threshold, or some people call it the lactate threshold, and we'll talk about that in a second. Once you exceed that threshold, it means that your body is taking glucose from your muscles and using a process called glycolysis, it's converting it to glycogen as an energy source. The problem is glycogen is really expensive. It takes a lot of energy to create it, and you don't have a lot of it. It depletes very, very quickly. So you're kind of on borrowed time. If you go past your anaerobic threshold, you exceed it, you're not going to be able to sustain that activity for very long. Some people prefer to call the anaerobic threshold the lactate threshold, and I think there's a case to be made that that's a more accurate description because it's the value, the heart rate above which your body is producing more lactic acid than what you can metabolize and dispose of, and so you get that lactic acid built up. And we've all felt that. Let's say you're doing squats, you get to a high rep range and your muscles start burning. That's lactic acid. So anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold, for our purposes, it's kind of the same thing. I'll probably call it anaerobic threshold because we have aerobic and anaerobic. It's just simpler, I think, for us to understand. Now, for those of you who are fitness nerds, you might say, well, wait a minute. Within the anaerobic zone, we have two zones. There's actually the lactate threshold and your alactate threshold where your body's using ATP as the primary fuel source. And yeah, that's true. I know all that. However, for our purposes, that's not really going to help us a lot in programming our fitness. If you are an elite level athlete or a very advanced level athlete working with a strength and conditioning coach that's a complete nerd and wants to dial in these separate systems, that's a whole separate thing. For most people in the world, that's a level of granularity that's not going to help us. So I'm going to talk about our anaerobic threshold, how we increase it, how we build the capacity to sustain output up in the upper range of our heart rate, and also how we increase our aerobic threshold. So think about this for a moment. If you could increase both of these values, imagine if you could push your anaerobic threshold much higher and your aerobic threshold much higher, you would be able to sustain much higher output. And by the way, the zone in between those two values, in between the anaerobic threshold and the aerobic threshold, we call it a blend. It's where you're using both oxygen and you're using glycogen. Depending on how hard you're pushing is going to determine the extent of that. If you're closer to your aerobic threshold, you're going to be fueling yourself mostly with oxygen. If you are pushing up toward the higher end of your heart rate, you're going to be using primarily glycogen. So there's that blend zone, which is really where we live most of the time when we train jiu-jitsu. However, the blend, that area, as it turns out, is really the least efficient way to train either of these two energy systems. And they are distinct energy systems. The way we train our aerobic capacity is not the same way that we train our anaerobic system. And it turns out if you camp out primarily in that blend range, which is what we do in jiu-jitsu, you're not targeting either of these systems the most efficiently. So how do we increase our aerobic threshold? Well, the way we do it is the way boxers, kickboxers, and wrestlers have been training for decades. You do low intensity, steady state training. If you train Muay Thai kickboxing in Thailand, what's the first thing you do every morning at 7 a.m.? You go run for an hour. There's some good news and there's some bad news with regard to your aerobic training. The good news is that you can make significant increases in your aerobic capacity over time. The bad news is it takes a long time. You have to commit to this as a long-term lifestyle. You'll probably make huge gains in your aerobic capacity in the first year of training. The second year, you'll have diminished returns. The third year, diminished returns. The elite level athletes who spend a decade doing this will generally get to a point where they're chasing that 1% gain in any given year. But the good news is you can achieve a lot of increase in your aerobic capacity within that first year, but you have to commit to it. So typically you want to do 2 sessions a week minimum. More is better. 2 low intensity, steady state training sessions, and you keep yourself right around your aerobic threshold. How do you know where your aerobic threshold is, since it's going to continue to increase as you do this? The rule of thumb is, can you carry on a conversation while you're running? Short sentences. How's it going today? Oh, pretty good, man. I'm doing great. That sort of thing. Short sentences. If you get to a point where you can't speak anymore, you're hitting this too hard. So aerobic training is low intensity, steady state. I used to go to the rec center near my house. Upstairs, they've got an indoor track. They have rowing machines. They have recumbent bikes. They have elliptical machines. They've got a stair climber. And I would just do 20 minutes of this, 20 minutes of that, 20 minutes of this, and 20 minutes of that. I would do my 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minute sessions. And I have to tell you, it bores me to tears. I hated doing it because it was really boring. If you have headphones and an iPhone, get some podcasts, get some music going, do anything to keep the boredom to a minimum. But that's the sort of commitment you have to make to increase your aerobic threshold. Let's talk about the anaerobic threshold. As you get to the top range of your heart rate, you start hitting that anaerobic threshold. The goal is to increase it. And just like with aerobic training, there's some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is you can actually increase your anaerobic threshold fairly quickly. Typically within a couple months of training, you will bring that level up. You're not going to bring it up a lot. There's some genetic factors. If you're genetically gifted, you might actually be able to increase it a lot. Most people see modest gains in their anaerobic threshold. The bad news is once you hit that gain that you're going to get within the first 2 to 3 months of training, you're probably not going to see much after that. So anaerobic training, in my opinion, is what you do when you're getting ready for an event. I was getting ready for my black belt test. Maybe you've got a competition. So typically you'll take 2 or 3 months out from the competition. You'll focus on your anaerobic training. You'll do all the stuff that I'm going to talk about, but you hit the anaerobic training really hard, knowing that you're going to be able to see a lot of improvements, a lot of gains there, but it's not something you do year in and year out. There are 2 ways that we train our anaerobic system. The first is what we call maximal intensity steady state. Maximal intensity steady state. Some people call it anaerobic threshold training or just threshold training. I think that's a better term because it tells you exactly what you're doing. The goal is to push your heart rate all the way up to your anaerobic threshold without going over, and camping out there for very long training sessions. Now, I didn't do specific threshold training. Why? Because when we train jiu-jitsu, we tend to be doing threshold training. If you keep your heart rate up toward the upper range of its limit, as long as you're below your anaerobic threshold, you are going to be doing maximal intensity steady state training. That's just the way it is. I was doing 5 jiu-jitsu training sessions per week when I was training, 5 hours per week of rolling, which meant that I was getting a lot of training, a lot of threshold training. And because I was tracking everything, I was tracking my heart rate, I was able to look at my sessions and begin getting a very good idea of exactly where my anaerobic threshold was and exactly how it felt to be right at that threshold. I got very good at gauging where my heart rate was at any given moment just based on how I feel. We call that the rate of perceived exertion, the RPE. Your rate of perceived exertion is how you perceive what you're doing. Now, to some extent, that's going to go down over time. As you build work capacity, your perception of it is that it's much easier, but that's a pretty good gauge, and you'll develop the ability to determine where your heart rate is at based on how you feel. And so I didn't do extracurricular threshold training. I just did a lot of jiu-jitsu, making sure that my heart rate was at the upper end of its range without going over. The second way we train our anaerobic threshold is through high intensity interval training. I was doing hill sprints, I was doing burpees, and I was doing kettlebell swings. You can do almost anything as long as it's an activity that allows you to push your heart rate beyond your anaerobic threshold. Basically, the way it works is you hammer, let's say you're doing sprints or whatever that activity is, you hammer, taking yourself almost to your maximum heart rate. You don't want to completely max yourself out, but you want to get close to your maximum heart rate. Once you hit that point, you'll know it because you can't sustain that activity more than probably 10, 12, 15 seconds, maybe 30 seconds if you're in killer shape, and your body just shuts down. You can't do that anymore. And then you stop, you let yourself recover. Usually you'll recover down to your aerobic threshold, so you get down to 130 beats per minute or so, maybe 120, and then you hammer again. There's a great hill by my house. It's just short enough that I can run the hill. By the time I get to the top of the hill, I'm toast. I'm done. And then I stop. I walk down the hill. By the time I'm at the bottom of the hill, my heart rate has stabilized again, and I can hammer again. How many intervals do you do? Well, when I started my training, I was doing like 3 or 4. I wasn't doing a lot. It's actually very physiologically expensive to do this sort of training, so you'll have to build up the work capacity to be able to do it. At first, I was just doing a few repetitions. Eventually, you get to where you can do 8 or 10 of these. And that's hard. It's harder than you think it is. If you're in amazing shape, I'm in my 50s. So for me, doing 8 of these, 8 cycles, 10 cycles, that was enough. That was good. If you're 20, maybe you do 12 to 15 of these. Again, the more the better, understanding that it's physiologically very taxing to do a lot of this. So high intensity interval training is how we push past our anaerobic threshold. And in doing so, we raise that threshold and we make it higher. And again, you're going to get your maximum benefits within a couple months, 3 months or so. After that, you're not going to see much of an increase. Now let's switch gears and talk about our neuromuscular system, starting with strength. The question is, how strong do we need to be to do jiu-jitsu? If you ask 10 strength and conditioning coaches, they're going to give you 10 different answers. You can go down an endless number of rabbit holes into the world of strength. Some coaches have objective standards that they want you to meet. They will put all their combat athletes on some objective training methodology where you have to develop enough strength to do like a 3 times body weight deadlift or a 2 times body weight squat, that sort of thing. Here's the thing. That kind of strength work takes a huge amount of time and it's very physiologically expensive. I had 5 to 6 months to get ready for my black belt demo, and I knew that I was not going to be able to increase my strength significantly. We all have finite energy. I was doing 2 training sessions per day most days, which was a huge amount of output for me in my 50s. And I just knew that I was not going to be able to invest a huge amount of time into strength training without it robbing from the other things that I was going to have to do. Recovery was a problem. Recovery was a perpetual problem that I had to keep battling against because I was perpetually overtrained and under-recovered, and managing that became a problem. So for me, I didn't want to try to meet any kind of objective strength standards. Instead, my goal was really a simple one. I wanted to increase my strength to weight ratio. I think that's really the most important metric, having a high strength to weight ratio. I don't have an exact metric for what that means, but in a practical sense, what it means is that you can move yourself efficiently on the mat. If you look at the highest level jiu-jitsu competitors out there, the guys that win the gold medals at all the competitions, you generally find guys that are not incredibly strong in an absolute sense. You usually find guys that are very strong relative to themselves so that they can move themselves efficiently over a long period of time. So having a high strength to weight ratio is really the goal. Jiu-jitsu is a movement art. Generally, we're trying to move ourselves. And the more efficiently you can do that, the better your performance is going to be. So for me, what I decided to do was 1 strength training session per week. Some weeks I would do 2, but generally I was doing 1. And I was focusing on the major movement patterns: squatting, hinging, pressing, and pulling. The 4 major movement patterns. I was also doing some abdominal core work, which I think is very important. I was also doing some loaded carries on some days, sometimes. I didn't do a ton of that, but I was adding some loaded carries to my arsenal. So here is a pretty good representation of the kinds of exercises that I was doing on my strength day. For squatting, I was doing barbell squats. I was doing kettlebell squats. Sometimes I would do thrusters, which combines a press and a squat. For my hinging motion, I was doing mostly kettlebell swings, but I did do some deadlifts. For my pressing motion, I was doing overhead presses, ring push-ups, and dips. For my pulling motion, I did pull-ups and bent over rows. And for my core abdominal work, I would do L-sits on my rings, I would do hanging leg raises, and I would do hollow body holds. In my opinion, building a lot of strength because it takes so much time. That's something you do in the off season when you have a lot of time and energy to devote to it. When you're training for a jiu-jitsu competition or an event like I was, you're not going to increase your strength very much. You're going to, you can build some strength, and it's about building some resilience, building some injury prevention from being stronger, that sort of thing. And so I was doing one strength training session per week. Now let's talk about something that I think is probably even more important than having absolute strength, and that is having a high degree of muscular endurance. If you think about what we're asked to do when we grapple, you're cycling those fast twitch muscles over and over and over. Maybe you have to move explosively to get past the guard, or you have to move explosively to get out from under side control, or you're trying to move explosively to get that takedown. So you're engaging your fast twitch muscles, and you tend to engage them over and over and over again. Fast twitch muscles contract 10 times faster than slow twitch muscles. They're very, very efficient, and they contract very, very fast. However, they are very expensive muscles. They tire very, very quickly. You'll burn out your fast twitch muscles really fast. So in my opinion, it's very, very important to train muscular endurance. You want those fast twitch muscles to be able to cycle over and over and over for an hour straight if you need to. So how do we build muscular endurance? Well, I've been very influenced by a guy named Viktor Selyunov. He was a Russian exercise physiologist who was very groundbreaking, actually. He's the guy, I believe he's the guy that brought the Tabata interval concept to the world. And if you've done CrossFit, you're very familiar with Tabata squats and Tabata intervals. He also came up with a concept called high intensity continuous training. The idea is to do an exercise that requires a relatively high level of intensity and be able to do that exercise for a long period of time in order to keep firing those fast twitch muscles. So the way it works in practice is you pick an exercise. I was typically doing box step-ups. I was doing some biking. I was doing kettlebells, I was doing burpees. It can be really any exercise that requires a certain amount of intensity to cycle, to do. And you want the duration fairly long, say 20 minutes, but because it is a high intensity exercise and the duration is fairly long, you have to keep the pace relatively slow. So how this might work, let's say you have a stationary bike, you crank up the resistance almost to the maximum to where it takes an immense amount of energy to do a half pedal. So you push it down, that's the high intensity, then you pause, then you pedal again, there's another burst of intensity, then you pause, then you do it again, and there's a burst of intensity. So you're cycling these intense bursts interspersed with a rest period, very short, but a rest period, and you keep that cycle going for 20 minutes. If you're doing kettlebell swings, which is what I was doing a lot of days, I would clean the kettlebell and I would do 3 very intense swings with a 70-pounder, and then I would set it down. And then you take a few breaths, and then you grab the kettlebell again and you do 3 swings and set it down. So you're doing a lot of work over a long period of time, high intensity, continuous, but the pace is slow enough that you can actually survive the 20 minutes. Or if you're doing burpees, you drop down for a burpee, you explode up very aggressively, you do your squat as part of it, and then you rest for a moment, take a breath or two, and then you do another one. So high intensity continuous training. I was doing one of these sessions every week. I was doing one strength training session. I was doing one high intensity continuous training session per week. And I have to tell you, these are hard. Toward the end of my training, I was doing 60 minutes of this. I would pick 3 different exercises, like box step-ups. I would explode up and lower myself, take a breath, explode up, lower myself, and so on. So I was doing 3 different exercises, 20 minutes each for an hour. And also I was doing loaded carries, not always on my high intensity continuous training sessions, but some days where I was feeling relatively fresh, I would also do some loaded carries, and I would do that 1 day a week. The last thing I want to talk about, which I consider kind of part of the neuromuscular system, and that is mobility work. Although your joints have a lot to do with having a high degree of mobility. Personally, I've always had pretty good mobility. And so I don't do a ton of mobility training on its own. I know some people swear by it. I should probably do more than what I do. But usually what I would do is a couple days a week, I would go to the dojo 30 or 40 minutes early, and I would just do some movement drills. I would do some animal movements. I would do some fundamental movements, some fundamental jujitsu movements, that sort of thing. Just getting the joints working. I wasn't trying to keep the intensity real high. I was just trying to do some of that mobility work. So to me, those are the three aspects that are most important as far as your muscular system. One, having a high strength to weight ratio. Number two, having a high degree of muscular endurance. And number three, having pretty good mobility. Although again, mobility isn't strictly a muscular thing, but I kind of lump it into that. So this is what my weekly training looked like. I was doing 2 low intensity, steady state training sessions per week. I was doing 1 strength session per week. I was doing 1 high intensity continuous training session per week. I was doing 1 high intensity interval training per week. And I was doing 5 jiu-jitsu rolling sessions per week. This is how I broke it down on a daily basis. So Monday, I was doing my strength training session in the morning. I was doing jiu-jitsu at night. Tuesday, I was going out and doing my cardio session. And then I was doing jiu-jitsu in the evening. Wednesday, I would do a high intensity continuous training session in the morning, and I would do jiu-jitsu at night. Thursday, I would just do 1 low intensity steady state session. Thursday to me was a little bit of a deloading day, a little bit of a recovery day. Friday, I would do my high intensity interval session. I would go do my hill sprints, and then I would do jiu-jitsu at night. And Saturday, I would go to open mat in jiu-jitsu, and I would train for an hour, hour and a half. And then Sunday, I would just recover. This is pretty much what my weekly training looked like. I would do this for about 3 weeks in a row, and then usually on the 4th week, I would mix it up a little bit, maybe do a couple weightlifting sessions that week, maybe back off on one of the elements. I would just try to mix it up a little bit periodically. But this is basically the blueprint that I followed for 5 months, and the results were spectacular. I'm going to show you some data here in a minute of a training session, a jiu-jitsu training session, and what I was able to achieve with this training methodology. So here is a jiu-jitsu training session that I did about 3 weeks out from my black belt exam. You can see the different heart rate zones. The pink zone is where I'm fully anaerobic. The yellow is where I'm right at my threshold, and so on. The duration of this session was about an hour. And let me walk you through here the different rolls I did. So this was roll number 1. You can see my heart rate increasing. It gets to about 150 beats per minute or so. And here's the rest period in between the rounds. Here's roll number 2. I'm up fully anaerobic. I'm up around 160 beats per minute or so, 163 beats per minute or so. Here's round number 3 starting. Round number 3, I think I went with someone who was probably pretty easy in class, maybe a newbie, maybe someone who's much less skilled than I was. So this was an easy round, a little recovery round. Here's round number 4. You can see the dropouts. When you wear a heart rate monitor while rolling, it's not ideal, and you do get dropouts. But round number 4, you can see that I was really high, fully anaerobic, that full round. Round number 5, I was hovering right around my threshold. I went over a few times. Here's the next round, fully anaerobic again. Here's the next round. I'm really hammering now. I get up to 171 beats per minute. Next round, really hard. I'm up, fully anaerobic again. Next round, last round, I'm hammering hard. I get to 172, which really is it. I mean, this is literally my maximum heart rate, and I was sustaining myself pretty close to my maximum. And I felt great. I was just an animal on the mat during this training, and you can see the results of that. To be almost fully anaerobic for an hour straight is actually incredibly impressive, especially for a guy in his 50s. So I hope this information really helps you. Again, I can't program your fitness. I'm not recommending that you should do what I did. It worked for me. I found a huge amount of benefit in doing so. The greatest benefit, honestly, was that I was able to maintain an incredibly high output. By the end of my training, I would walk into the dojo and I was like a shark. I would walk in and scan the room, and I was thinking, I'm going to tap everybody in this room multiple times. And people would tell me, even my better students would tell me, they're like, man, I don't know what you're doing right now, but you are just in the zone. And the biggest place I noticed it was in my unwillingness to concede anything. The thing about jiu-jitsu is when we get tired, we start to concede. You start to concede positions, you might concede the guard pass, you don't fight things quite as hard, you concede, maybe you don't try to get out from a disadvantaged position quite as aggressively because you're getting tired. And usually, maybe you're aggressive for the first 3 minutes of the roll, and then the last 2 minutes you're conceding a little bit more because you're getting tired. Or maybe you're great for the first 3 or 4 rolls of the night, and then you start conceding a little bit. And so the biggest takeaway that I got, the biggest benefit I got from this style of training was that I simply didn't concede. I would go into every rolling session, and I don't care how long that rolling session was, an hour, hour and a half straight, great. I'm gonna keep pushing, keep pushing. I didn't concede anything. I would fight the guard pass. I would get out from disadvantaged spots. So that was the greatest takeaway. Is this a healthy way to train week in and week out on a long-term basis? Probably not. But it's the kind of thing that is pretty necessary if you're a competitor or if you're training for certain events. I mean, to me, this was the kind of training that I think is most appropriate leading up to an event. You're really trying to hammer all those energy systems in order to optimize each of those systems. During the off season, maybe you focus more on strength training, maybe you focus more on mobility, maybe you focus on other things. So again, your mileage may vary. I'm not trying to tell anybody this is how they should train. I'm just providing this for informational purposes, and I hope you got something out of it. See you next time.